Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derrick Lambert. We have Dr. Gad Barnea joining us today. How are you?
I'm good. Good to be with you.
Excellent, excellent. Look, you've said some controversial stuff recently on my channel, Myth Vision, and Neil's channel over at Gnostic Informant, pertaining to Moses, pertaining to Yahwism. So many ideas that we really should be reevaluating and considering the conclusions we draw. They may be true, but we don't have evidence that concludes those things rather than hypothetically assuming. Meaning, when we look at the evidence, epigraphic, archaeological evidence for what we find Judeans practice, believe in the hard evidence of these categories, we don't see any evidence of them practicing the laws in the Torah, them maintaining these ideas that the Torah says all of Israel repented, all of Israel turned and practiced and followed these ways. Where is that in the record? So we don't see that. You and Jonathan Adler have been highlighting this, and it gets me in trouble. But that's okay, because I don't mind getting in trouble. Today, we need to dive into continuing your discussion that you had with Neil. So if you haven't watched that video, you really should, on the origins of Yahwism, how far back, the name theophorically, there's all sorts of stuff you guys cover. Going from your specialty, the Persian period, what is Yahwism? Let's start there.
So my definition of Yahwism is really very simple. It's basically a group of people whose common denominator is that a deity by the name of Yah is the head of the pantheon. That's it. I mean, really nothing more. There are no special, commandments or any kind of, cultic practices that are necessarily unique to them. Of course, they do follow cultic practices, but these are cultic practices that are common to all the peoples in the region. So that's not unique. Like, for example, the Elephantine temple, they offer sacrifices, but again, these sacrifices are not special.
Right.
And so really the definition of Yahwism is very, very simple.
So getting into that God, that deity, what are the attributes of this deity? Is this a crafter? Is this a deity that they think created things? Do we have evidence in Elephantine, Babylonia, in Levant that indicate that they think this god is supreme, like Marduk, like other deities?
Well, that's a great question. And actually that ties to the video we just did with Neil, where we talked about Khnum. And so with Khnum, we mentioned that there must have been some form of assimilation between Khnum and Yah that allowed or caused the Egyptian authorities to allow the Yahwists to build a temple to Yah, literally touching the outside of the temple, the precinct of the Khnum temple. Khnum temple was a precinct, not just one temple, but an entire area. Much
more a big deal.
Yeah,
it's like, here's my brother. It's okay because he's my brother in a way.
So there must have been something that allowed that caused the Egyptian authorities to allow this, and there probably was some kind of assimilation between Khnum and Yah. And we also mentioned early on that we do have in the document record people blessing, so Yahwists blessing other Yahwists by the name of Yah and Khnum.
Okay.
Together. So it looks like there was some kind of assimilation between Yah and Khnum. So going back to your question, what we do know about Khnum, and we don't necessarily know about directly from the document record about Yahweh, is that Khnum was a creator god, and not just a creator god, but the creator of man. So Khnum has this potter's wheel, where he creates, in the Egyptian theology, that's how he creates man, on the wheel. We find that imagery also in the Bible. What's beautiful also, and that goes back to Genesis, really, about the, inhaling or into the nostrils of man to make man. Khnum would create the human on the potter's wheel, but his daughter, Anuket, would insert the ankh, the force of life, into the nostrils of man, and that's represented pictographically on a lot of Egyptian material. So almost the identical idea of the
Yeah.
creation of man in Genesis.
Would you say that it's actually the Khnum one is mythology with a knot and other but the Yahweh one happened. He really did create literally man.
Of course.
Okay, I was just making sure we're on the same page. Yeah, of course he. Okay,
Yeah.
of course I'm being funny.
Yeah. Of course.
Because that's kind of we're coming from an area, believe it or not, you scholars living in Ivory Tower.
Yeah.
We down here in the using Platonism at the bottom of the barrel are looking at this going, that literally happened.
Yeah.
That didn't literally happen. I'm being funny because we're scholarly here, but
one of the reason why for me it's so important also to engage in these, in YouTube videos and all these interactions is to not be in the ivory tower and to really share with the world. And I really trust the intelligence of the people listening to this, and I certainly respect the intelligence of the people listening to this, to understand that we are sharing our research. Of course, they have whatever they were brought up with,
right.
And it's fine to engage and disagree, but we want at least to share. At least I want to share my research with them, and so that they can at least engage and have an idea of where really the cutting edge now of relevant research is, and yeah, so just be knowledgeable about it.
This is so important. So getting our railroad tracks back on the train back on the tracks is Yahwism, and how we would try to understand this deity in the Persian period, because we're going to move forward and we're going to get to Christianity. People have to stay tuned because this is going to be a deep dive. We want to look at the letters, the fragments, the evidence that they give and attribute to this deity. However, when we don't have that and we see it so close to other deities like Khnum, it is a little bit of subjective, maybe speculation, conjecture. However, that we would look to other cults, other practices, and say, hey, the cult of Yahwism is behaving and acting similar ways. Maybe these attributes of these other deities are also attributed to their deity. Do we have any evidence in the papyri at that time that gives us more data about Yahweh, like who he is, what he does, what his role is in worship?
Not really. The papyri or the ostracon are not so
Theologically,
they're not theological, and they are not really. I mean, very few of them deal with cultic matters.
got it.
There is an ostracon that I published last year of a Yahwistic, so a kind of Jewish, let's say, priestess that serves in the temple of Yahweh at Elephantine. And there's a curse text there that I published that we didn't know about. I mean, it was really hiding in plain sight, because the text, we knew about the text, it was just misunderstood all these years, and misread. But my interpretation of this shows that it is a very, very well-defined genre of curse texts. And a priestess so that's really beautiful, because usually in Judaism / Yahwism, we think only of male priests, right? And only officiating in the temples are only male priests. But here it's a direct, firsthand proof that there was a priestess serving in the temple, and not only that, but also commanding the deity.
Ooh, okay.
Which is which fits the genre of these texts, which we are familiar with across the Mediterranean. So it's a very well-defined genre, and this fits that genre perfectly. And even the fact that it has a priestess rather than a priest fits the genre.
Got it.
Although there are some male priests too, but in some cases, but usually these are priestesses who are responsible for this. So that shows something about the theology there, that it is a deity that is concerned with justice, with the rendering justice. That's what the curse text is all about. So a deity that is concerned. We talked about creation. Of course, all major deities in antiquity were at certain points. I mean, late in the Iron Age and later and it depends where. For in Egypt, of course, the theology was much more developed, but a lot of the major deities are creator gods, obviously.
And so this different in each region. So, like, I guess before we leave Persian period, and you might have to constantly reflect back to connecting threads into Hellenism in that period. But is it different when you go to Babylon? We see the region where there were Yahwist, their form of cult, their form of practice? Do we have indications in that material that says this is different than over there? Or is it kind of in the Persian period similar?
It's similar in a way. It's interesting. We talked, so in the previous video with Neil that we just did, we talked about the triads a lot. And in Babylonia, the Yahwists did have a triad.
Say what a triad
The
is.
triad is just 3 deities, usually a kind of a family cell. Usually you have a father and a mother deity with a daughter or a son. And so usually it's just 3. It's a kind of a family unit of deities. Usually
The Trinity. Got it. Okay.
It's not a trinity.
I'm just kidding.
It's not a trinity because it's not a 1 and 2. A 3 and 1 and 1 and 3.
Right.
There's a 3 individuals.
You can say a proto form.
Although the Egyptians did have a 3 and 1 and 1 and 3. They did have that idea. So the Egyptians did have a trinity to speak of. But here we're talking about a triad. That's different. And so and so in Babylonia, in what we talked about earlier about Elephantine, they had a triad with Yao, Eshem Bet El, and Anat Bet El. Okay, so these are this is really a Yahwistic triad per se.
During the Persian period.
During the Persian period at the end, very end of the 5th century. In Babylonia, there is a wedding contract that is done between two individuals with Babylonian names, but all of the witnesses have Yahwistic names. Okay, so it's,
the deities the same names?
These are just the individuals for now. I'll get to the deities, but the wedding is between 2 people with Babylonian names, but certainly they were Yahwists because all of their witnesses are Yahwists. They are clearly part of the same community. And so the contract ends with an oath. And the oath is to the local triad of the Babylonian area of Nabu, Marduk, Nabu, and I forget the female deity there. But so they swear, these are Yahwists that take an oath in the name of the local triad of Babylon. Okay. So that shows that the triad was just simply a very popular concept throughout antiquity, and for understandable reasons. I mean, again, it is a family cell, right? If the deity is a human, you also have the family, kind of the family unit, which is a greater power, or at least a different format.
You mentioned the deity being human, or at least anthropomorphic in some way. Are you suggesting that in the 5th century, even Yahweh himself is portrayed with that same, we're still carrying those characteristics?
Probably, yeah. Of course, we don't have any actual depiction of Yahweh at that point. We have Yahweh depicted visually in the 4th century as a human. So we do have Yahweh on a coin from the 4th century in Yahud, in Judea, sitting on the wheel with sitting on the wheel with wings and holding.
I thought that was Zeus, though, Gad. Now, could it be both?
Well, it could. I mean, assimilation between. We just talked about this Yahwist who had Zeus on the other side of his coin. So the assimilation with Zeus is natural, but this one is clearly a depiction of Yahweh on the coin. I mean, there are some who disagree with this, but I think most scholars agree that this is a depiction of Yahweh. Now, in Judea, we have jar handles with basically an image of a lion, like the animal lion, with a sun disk on top. And so that's very common in the Persian period in Judea to have this. So this is in Judea. So these are Jews basically. These are Yahwists that represent a lion with a sun disk, meaning a divine lion. Sun disk is always deity. When something has a sun disk on top, that represents in antiquity a deity. So you have a lion with a sun disk on top on a lot of these jar handles in Judea, almost certainly representing Yahweh as a lion. And in fact, we also find that in the Bible. We have, I mean, even the beginning of the book of Amos, right? That Yahweh roars like a lion, right? And so we have this image of Yahweh as a lion, but also pictographically represented on jar handles in the Persian period.
Okay, there's a lot here.
Yeah.
And there's much more, of course, you get in your book about, for those who don't know, get the book. It's in the description. You don't want to miss it. So we have to move forward because we will spend an entire 3 years on this one area and never get anywhere.
Sure.
And you and Neil already did that. So I kind of want to push forward into the Hellenistic period. You have, even in our off-record conversations, constantly bring up Alexandria. Like Gnosticism, Hellenism, these ideas of Christian origins, the Essenes, the Qumran sect dealing with messianism. What is going on? There is a wild, wild west, and people tend to think, oh no, that happened just in 2nd century AD. There are many scholars who do think it's the wild, wild west with Christians, and it is, rightly so. Essenes, the Basilides, me and Neil were just talking about some interesting early Gnostic-y. That's another question of what does that even mean? So moving into the Hellenistic period, Alexandrian Library, how significant is this? And how significant is Hellenism and the Alexandrian Library, Alexandria period, in terms of Yahwism and its spread, in your view?
Hugely significant. I mean, in fact, it completely changed the way, I mean, the world from that point to our day, really. I mean, Alexandria was a watershed moment in the history of the world, really. Now, what happened, to understand Alexandria a little bit, only on Alexandria we can talk for hours, obviously, but just to understand Alexandria, it was, and we talked about this also in the previous episode with Neil, and I think with you also, we talked when we talked about Moses. The city of Alexandria was truly science fictional for antiquity. And as we said, there were coin-operated machines. They had doors opening automatically. It was a grid. The entire design of the system was grid-based. It was very scientific, as you know, in the sense of science for that that period.
I mean, if you had doors opening back then.
Yeah.
You don't even have central heating and air, though they did have some interesting ways in which they would try to keep.
Well, it was based. Yeah, the doors were based on the heat from the altar,
of course,
going down, in the temple opening from that. But so it looks like the deity accepted the sacrifice. But it was really, truly, like it seemed to people coming from outside of Alexandria to Alexandria, it seemed like they're entering a new dimension or something. It's completely new, innovative, exciting, something that they've never seen before. Now, within that city, now the whole vision for this city came ultimately from Aristo. And from Aristo's heir and successor, Theophrastus. And who probably had the vision. It was a person who actually, he probably never set foot in Alexandria, but he had the vision for the library and for this type of city and this type of kind of scientific endeavor, again, scientific for that period, of looking at these different texts, collecting these different texts together, seeing what the problems might have been, and harmonizing them and editing them, and all of these methodologies that they applied to their own text, the Hellenistic texts, that were also later applied a few decades later, probably, to the Hebrew text.
That's what I was going to ask you too, is that here you have what seems to be a mostly oral religion that is only well known through word of mouth, through
it's not well known anywhere.
Right.
It is transmitted, some of it is transmitted through word of mouth, and some of it is new. It's absolutely new from the Hellenistic period.
That's the job, right? Your job is trying to sift and find. I think this was ex nihilo at this period, at least ex nihilo based on the well-known established ideas here, and then some of it might root back to
And some of it is not ex nihilo, but it is still new. And what I mean by that, it's a response to it's a polemical response to how the non-Jews saw the Jews. And we talked about this.
Yes.
So that a lot of this material was composed in order to respond to these outside views of what the Yahwists were and what the Jews were. Some of it was material that was orally transmitted. or texts that existed in some way, shape, or form somewhere in some archive.
I'm glad we got you on record saying this, because some people are going to misunderstand even our previous discussions, maybe not get to the point where you're like, no, I think there is a continuity of culture, tradition, orality, like Homer, like anyone else. But if you think Homer is literally just keeping something that's truly been 500 years earlier, he has everything the same way it was back here in the late Bronze, early Iron Age,
Right.
you have another thing coming, because there's a lot that developed between those 500 years that they're adding in, they're developing, and who's to know what is and what isn't?
That's right.
So that's the scholar's task. But
That's right. But that type of scholarship was developed in Alexandria at the library. They developed the methodologies. They developed they saw that there are different versions of Homer, different versions of Hesiod, different versions of these different sources, and that might disagree. And so they sat, and sometimes they put the different versions side by side, like we find in the Bible. Sometimes they harmonized them. They added maybe material to kind of provide the glue between them. All of these different techniques to deal with these texts were developed in Alexandria and then later applied to the enterprise of putting the Bible together as well.
Real quick on that, jumping back to the Persian period, Seth L. Sanders, I did an episode with him, and he made a remark saying that the elite, the social elite in Persia, rebelled against one of the kings or rulers that were actually the scribes. They ruled the school. Due to that, they kicked them out and put in what we would maybe call Judeans, or at least Judeo, or some form of a term that would categorize these people, who then would learn, not only did they already know Aramaic, of course, but they would learn these deeper languages, these older languages, which then taught them the ideas.
I'm not sure what he's talking. I mean, so what he's saying is that there was a rebellion of
there was local Persians who rebelled. In some way, they were like families, aristocratic families that were in control of the schooling and teaching at the temples and stuff. And because they either revolted or they protested in some way, the king was like, and put new people in. And in doing so, they then learned about these Babylonian, Mesopotamian, deeper, older traditions, which you see kind of continuity into the Essene sects, where you see some of the Babylonian math or calculations or even things like that. He is saying he thinks they're starting that scribal tradition back here. However, you're looking at the Hellenistic period thinking, if there is some, maybe there is some back here. Nobody maybe is denying that there could have been something back here, but you're saying that's not what they were doing at the period.
there's simply so we have thousands of Yahwistic documents, primary sources from Egypt. I mean, when I say documents, it's not only textual, it's also the coins that we talked about and all that. So if we look at all of these documents, coins, papyri, ostraca, etc., whatever it is that we find, tablets also in Babylonia, written in cuneiform. So if we look at all of these thousands of documents together, we don't see anything that remotely even relates to the biblical text that we know. Now, they were, of course, relatively literate in Elephantine. We have the people were, even though the scribes probably wrote most of the ostraca and the papyri, the people who received them were able to read them, right? So they were able to understand at least some of the. Maybe they had people read it to them. It's in certain cases, but at least there are so many. You have to understand that at least a lot of them were able to read the documents. Again, ostraca are shards of vessels, like jars and things like that were broken, and on them they wrote short messages, a few lines really, and so these are the old, the ancient world's SMS.
That's so cute. I can't wait to meet her.
Very
mom. Yeah.
like, absolutely. And so really we have these short messages that, and these are clearly not very sophisticated. I mean, these are really personal messages.
Got it.
And so people were much more literate at that point than we give them credit for. And also that's across the empire, not just at Elephantine. And
You know what I'm bringing up with this idea that many scholars think the activity of the scribal practices of biblical stuff, they even go back before that. They want to say in Babylon, they want to go back and say, well, some of this material goes way back here. We've already did a show on that. And I don't want to get lost in that, but I just wanted to bring that up to point out you're one of those academics who actually questions that validity of that claim, at least pertaining to the biblical tradition.
pertaining to the biblical, I mean, clearly, scribal practices and scribal traditions go back a lot, and even I would even go further back than a lot of other scholars to say. I don't think, for example, that there was a long period where where they lost, like between after the Bronze Age collapse. Often people say, well, they kind of lost the ability to write it. From what I mean, before the Bronze Age collapse, you had a lot of writing, like the El Amarna text, and a lot of, I mean, a lot of documentation, administrative documentation, and letters, and so people were able to write and communicate pretty well. And after the Bronze Age collapse, or within that period of the dark period after the Bronze Age collapse, we see a lot less writing. But we do see writing, and they didn't lose writing. It's just that they didn't have the same networks, administrative networks across Egypt, and we don't have. I mean, also keep in mind, if we found the Amarna text almost by accident,
Right.
in Egypt, so who knows what else is out there. But we do see, for example, even within the dark period of the Bronze Age collapse, we see people writing on arrowheads. Now, writing on the arrowhead, of course, it's not a long text, but for someone to write on an arrowhead, that means that they can write. These are soldiers. These are simple soldiers writing something on. So literacy was still
A thing.
a thing, even though it's not a long text. It's not an interesting text per se, but
Right.
the very fact that they would do that, and these are simple soldiers, means that literacy was not completely lost during that dark period. And I think it should get more attention. So scribal traditions continued, and they continued for a long time. And there were ebbs and flows, of course, but they continued.
But in Hellenistic period, that is when, like, this is scribal heaven. This is where you're not just scribes, like you talked about. There are libraries that contain material. They had, here's where we're going to kind of document and leave these kind of things. They are actively teaching and training, and the goal is to educate, not just a scribe.
Yeah, but let me stop you there. That was also the case much earlier.
Okay.
In Egypt, the scribal profession was extremely, authoritative. There are hymns to scribes. There are stories about how the scribes are seen, and so the scribes were extremely important. In Egypt from millennia before the Hellenistic period. And the scribes were extremely well regarded in Babylonia and across the ancient world. What happened, the difference with the Hellenistic period, is again going back to Alexandria. What happened there is that you suddenly started, and again, that is the effect of Aristo and of Theophrastus, looking at texts critically. Aristo was really kind of the guiding force behind this, because he looked at everything critically. Right. He looked at Plato critically. He checked everything that Herodotus said. He put to the test. Right. Herodotus said, well, the Ethiopians do this, or the Egyptians do this, and he actually sent people to test that out.
Right.
That's Aristo, and that's a big change from people before him, actually thinking critically about everything and testing everything. So that's a huge change from previous generations. I mean, and this is what eventually led Aristo's vision through Theophrastus, led to the founding of the Alexandrian Library, as we know. Now, once you get into that mindset of a critical view of the text, that changes your entire relationship with the text. It's not just, writing, documenting things, or just expressing, different administrative realities or contracts, or even letters between people. Now there's a whole other dimension to this. There is a critical dimension to certain texts. Of course, administrative texts don't necessarily need that, but certain texts do need a different approach. And now scribes get another kind of feather in their cap, right? They have a different role, or an additional aspect to their, or additional parameter or dimension to their role. And I think that what happened after Alexandria changed not just, we talked about the Hebrew Bible, but it really changed. The main thing it changed is it gave literary texts authority.
Mm-hmm.
That is the main, whether it's the Bible, whether it's Homer, whether it's, but it gave a certain sense of authority to literary text. It only started there, and it eventually became, scripture, right? I mean, they're like New Testament, and of course, the Hebrew Bible and other texts as well became more and more authoritative. And this was a lengthy process of text becoming more and more and more authoritative over time, which has huge implications on humanity, both positive and very, very negative as well.
This idea of text and obviously eventually canonization, which is later down the road, but it's like proto versions of here's why later on you get sacred texts that are standstill like this and the way that they're treated. I wonder, getting back to Yahwism, as time proceeds forward and we notice that there are groups of Judaism, if you will. I don't even know if that's the proper term, because you have Enochian Judaism, you have Mosaic type Judaism, you have various forms of Judaism. And in these different groups, even when we find the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are different Yahwistic theologies that kind of portray a different Yahweh. Destiny is foretold and determined, to free will type concepts hundreds of years before Jesus. This debate of Calvinism and Arminianism in those theological groups, they think this started with like early Christians and not realizing this was already happening earlier among Jews. And it wouldn't shock me among Greek thinkers and such about the soul and do we have free will, all these questions. So I'm curious, do we have any evidence of text, sacred text, or maybe that's not the right term. I would imagine using sacred text, but sacred may mean you can't change it, so let's not use that term. Are there texts that are important to Yahwism that we've lost, that were part of groups of Yahwist that are not the biblical canon, that aren't Bible texts that we have, aren't Enochian, that didn't make it into our certain canons? Do you know if we've lost any that may have had back here into the BC area?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, of course, there were texts. There are texts that are mentioned in the Bible, like the Book of Yashar and things like that. All of these, all of these acts that were taken by aren't they all written in that book, the other book that we don't have, right?
Right.
And so we do have, of course, and obviously there are texts that we've lost, and we don't even know that we've lost them until we might find them somewhere in the cave that we haven't excavated yet. But there are stories now. One of a Dead Sea Scroll that I've restored, which is very interesting. It's it's a relatively small scroll. But it was preserved by the Dead Sea Scrolls sect, or at least the people of Qumran, and it contains an Achaemenid court tale, which is very, very interesting. But in it, it does have a doxology for the deity. It doesn't say Yahweh, but it says the high God. But it does say the high God, and who sees all the earth, and the earth is his, etc., etc. So there is a certain theology in that scroll that is not biblical per se. I mean, it's kind of it's not far from the biblical, but it's something different. And so that scroll is very, very interesting, very truly eye-opening in many ways.
Mm-hmm.
But that's in Qumran, and we didn't know about what it really said until I restored it, and I haven't published it yet. I mean, it's very close to being to finish the manuscript, and I just gave a lecture in Penn State about this particular scroll. But the
What's so unique about it?
about the scroll?
Yeah.
Well,
What it's saying.
the scroll, it begins with a story of this really righteous man, pious and very, very, very loyal to the king. This is what's really important to the Achaemenids. Being loyal to the king is the number one virtue. And so this person called Pateriza, who is the father of the hero of the story, and he's being praised. We don't have the first column of the scroll. We see that in the second column of the scroll. Again, each column is only 7 lines, so we don't. The fact that we don't have the first column doesn't mean that you've lost a lot. It's only 7 lines of text. It's not insignificant, but we still understand that this is praising this person. And then there is the scene of the finding of the book, of the authoritative book, which is a very common scene in antiquity. There's at the right moment, someone finds the right book, like with Josiah, right?
I was just about to call
Josiah, exactly. So at the right moment, someone finds the book that changes everything. And that's also there. And so, but in the case of this particular scroll, that book is the Bisutun inscription of Darius I. And there's a paraphrase of Bisutun at the end of this column, and which it says they opened it, they read it, and in it was found written, and then a paraphrase from the Bisutun inscription. For those who don't know, the Bisutun inscription is Darius I's major literary work that describes all the rebellions against him and how he rose to power. But it also has wisdom texts and ethics and philosophy and theology. I mean, it has everything really in that. In this text, it's written on the side of the mountain, the Mount Bisutun in western Iran today, and just a massive inscription on the side of the mountain.
I've seen that.
Yeah, it looks like a seal impression on the mountain.
Big, long.
Beautiful.
So this is that Darius.
So it paraphrases that a certain specific paragraph of the Bisutun inscription.
Got it. And this is written in the Hellenistic. What you discovered and deciphered was something written during the Hellenistic period.
Well, it was copied during the Hellenistic, or really the Roman period. So
got it.
Late 1st century, before the Common Era, or early 1st century of the Common Era.
Got it.
That's when it was copied. But so this story, the scroll has this paraphrase of Bisutun. The particular passage that it's paraphrasing deals with the person who is a liar, and how you should stay away from people who are liars and violent people, and how to deal with them. It's a very, very famous passage from Bisutun that certainly affected a lot of people in the empire at the time. Thinking about those liars and those people who are conspiring against the king and against others. So that's the paraphrase. That's the passage from Bisutun that it's paraphrasing. The rest of the scroll is a legend, an exegetical legend, designed to explain that particular passage from Bisutun via legend. So it presents a person who conspires against the king and against the hero, Bagsaro, the hero of the story. And there are 2 visions that Bagsaro sees, in which the Bagoshi, who's the villain in the story, is conspiring against the king and against Bagsaro. And now going back to the scribe, Bagsaro has 2 visions that are almost identical about this person conspiring against the king. He goes and tells the king about this, and then right at the middle of the scroll, we have this passage where the king confronts Bagoshi with these 2 visions. And of course, in antiquity, if you have a vision that's recurring twice and it's almost the same, it's a clear sign that God.
Right.
And we see it in the Bible, of course, with Joseph and with the king of the dreams of Pharaoh, but also with Socrates. We see it in his
well-known trope.
Yeah, the recurring visions. And then at the middle of the scroll, it says, the house of the terror of the house of the scribe fell on him. Beautiful, right in the center. And from that point on, of course, they punish this conspirator and his 6 co-conspirators, but also there's the doxology of the deity and the end of the hero Bagsaro of the story. So it's just a beautiful court tale that we didn't know anything about until I restored it. So it's really we knew. I mean, independent fragments were published, but It wasn't restored. And so there is a lot that all this ties into what you said about what we might not know. And this we know only now, but we might find even among the fragments that are that we already know exist among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are a lot of fragments that haven't been assigned yet. And so there might be other things that are hiding in plain sight, even among the fragments that we know about, but also there might be other caves and other places that we haven't looked at yet that might bring to light additional sources that we don't know about. What's really important to understand is that this entire period was effervescent. People were constantly, especially after Alexander, I think Alexander really kind of launched humanity in that region into a new phase of just being obsessed with texts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And like all of these stories from different regions too, like really trying to bring it all in together, right? And synthesize it in a way.
And vying for authority. I mean, the texts were not sacred yet, and you were right to point out that they had no problems changing the text, and so they were not sacred in that sense, but they were competing.
So yeah, we really, there's so much here. I feel like we really would need like a week, video after video, show after show, to really dive into so much of the complexities you've researched and discovered. What I'd like to do is just highlight in passing as we going into Yahwism and discussing how this works in the broader world. Because when I think of Yahweh, I think of Jews, I think of Judaism, I think of Hebrew Bible. Notice now it's exclusively a text typically. We don't really think about that Enochian stuff. We don't really think about those non-biblical canon stuff because we're trained to think in a bubble. And then my brain is doing this over these years of learning. So I'm looking at Stephen Mitchell's work, One God in Pagan Rome, I think it is, or pagan. Anyway, the term pagan's already a problem, but you get the point that non-Jewish people are already, even the pre-Socratics are doing what is megatheism. They're already seeing a one God concept, or at least an an ultimate deity that rules and runs the show, and all of the others are subordinates. But worshiping only one deity. Like, even though you have these other deities, you start to see that start to rise during this period, and there is what we would consider polytheism. So the question is, how did we get Yahwism to become a thing? Or really, some people might go, the only Yahwism I know of is Judaism from the Maccabees, the Hasmonean period, and the Enochian little sects that are in the Dead Sea, Qumran communities, or at least associating with them. They would only associate Yahweh with Jewish people, and that's a whole nother can of worms to deal with, like who makes up that category. But then they would only say that non-Jews start to enter in as God-fearers. You might have a sprinkle here or a sprinkle there in the biblical text if you count that tradition and count that as somehow historical in the way they do. But like, it's only when these God-fearers show up that decide, I like Bob. Bob's a nice Jew. Let me see what his little synagogue has going on. Oh, he's a nice God. I'll just keep Zeus and Athena and Dionysus and all this. But I'm also going to come check out Yahweh. He's pretty cool. That's kind of how, and I'm doing a bad job probably, but in a nutshell, they think that's how the Yahweh gets introduced to the non-Jewish world. Is here are these synagogues that are imitating Greek thought, but like they don't really have anything to do with Yahwism. That sounds like you're saying that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, so Yahwism was the only, really, there wasn't Judaism per se until the 2nd century before the Common Era. So when I say Judaism, I mean, yes, Yahweh is the main God, but also there are commandments that he imposes on the people. There is a narrative about him, how he created the world and how he manages the world, and what makes him angry, what makes him, reverse his opinion, things like that. So that narrative, that idea, that view of Yahweh is very late, and that's 2nd century. Roughly speaking, 2nd century before the Common Era, Hasmonean period.
Got it.
So we thought we can really talk about that kind of Judaism, actual Judaism, from the 2nd century before the Common Era. Before that, we have Yahwism, and as I said, the definition is very simple. Yah as the head of the pantheon. Nothing else is really unique to that particular cultic system. And so that's Yahwism. Now, Yahwism was very deeply ingrained within Yahwistic communities. The development of a narrative about Yahweh and and all of the commandments and all of that, that was something that kind of was spawned out of Yahwism by the trigger of the Alexandria Library, as I said earlier. It continued, but Yahwism continued unabated, continued to exist, continued to be very strong, and continued to be very popular also.
Okay, I'm a layman.
Yeah,
and please don't mind my jumping in. I have to be taught by the man. When I look for the evidence, I see we have the biblical text and we have a group of Hasmoneans, and we see them using this as their nationalistic, if you will, identity and
propagandistic.
Propagandistic. You're suggesting, and I love that you hinted at this, but I don't want to get lost back in Alexandria because that's a whole nother world we can explore deeper. We've already explored it a little, but there's so much more. That is, in Alexandria, Yahwism spreading, but you have a group of people who seem to be really propagandistically reacting to forms of Yahwism. What evidence of Yahwism is there among non-Jewish groups at this period? Do we have epigraphic, archaeological, any papyri that has them using this god in the BC area? I know it's hard enough to find it for Jewish texts. So people, this is the problem, right? Because now you're having to go, okay, hold on, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you know this. We're lucky we found the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Derrick, you're asking for a miracle, a needle in a haystack to even find this stuff, but we may have some.
You're lucky to have found Elephantine. That's completely no one was expecting this.
Right.
When we found the Elephantine documents, no one was expecting to find anything. It wasn't mentioned anywhere. It was a complete surprise. So who knows what else we're still missing? And I'm looking forward to future discoveries, which I'm sure will help shed more light on all of this.
Right.
But in the BC, late BC, we start to find examples of Yahweh worship outside of the kind of properly speaking Jewish realm. Now, most of these are in amulets, curse texts, and things like that.
Right. Magical
papyri, and again, amulets, curse texts, protective gear, and things like that. So that's, but that we find all over the Mediterranean.
Right.
I mean, from modern day England, actually, to Egypt and to Palestine. So we find literally, I mean, so much. This was a lot more popular. So Yahwism, just the idea that Yahweh is the top god.
Right. No temple needed necessarily. No sacred. Here's our story we have to have in this book. It's this deity which you could bring with you wherever.
That's right.
They are believing in this deity. They're calling upon this deity. They are
absolutely. They believe that this deity will protect them. Absolutely.
Okay.
So, and that was extremely popular. I mean, we have, of course, later on, Macrobius. That's 5th century,
right,
of the Common Era. But still, then he's compiling the Saturnalia. He's compiled this. It's a compendium of the different religions, cultic systems,
right,
within the Roman world, and he's using sources that are much more ancient.
Exactly.
Going back centuries before him. So he talks about Yahweh as the head of the pantheon of even the Greek gods.
Got it.
I mean, he's the top, and he says something like, in the summer Yahweh is Hades, and in the spring he is something else, I forget. But he's basically he has a whole confederacy of deities, not just a triad, but a whole system of deities under Yahweh is the top deity. But he's not Jewish, he's not Christian, he's not even a Yahwist. He's just repeating, collecting and documenting the cultic systems that were active in his own day. But that shows that this term Yahweh started to take on a life on its own, independently from Judaism, independently from obviously from Christianity, which was at that time, or just a small. I mean, at the time of Macrobius, it was already the religion of the empire.
Right.
But before that, it was just this relatively small sect that was very, very quickly spreading. Now, I also am convinced that the spread of Christianity was driven by Yahwism.
Got it.
I mean, Yahwism just simply prepared the ground so well for these ideas to be absorbed into that ground, so that Christianity was able to spread much more quickly than it would have been otherwise.
This is such an interesting road we're about to go down here, and I'm hoping you have something to contribute on this in terms of maybe your understanding pertaining to Mithras, as obviously it takes a kind of a different reinterpretation later in Roman period, but it is this long-standing Persian deity that continues all the way back, and
It's different from the Persian. I mean, it's the same name,
right,
give or take, but it's very different.
It's very different by this period, but I guess here you have these competing Sol Invictus Mithras kind of thing, right? That you would think, okay, all the way back here, you have this god called upon that really, I guess, answer the question pertaining to that, right? Is this Mithras in some way, is there some form of continuity where the Romans have obviously reworked it for their own needs and desires and cults and in a mystery religion? But that would have softened the ground, right? For what later became that we're either going down the Sol Invictus route, the Mithras route, or the Christian route.
That's right.
And they chose Christianity over the Sol Invictus. Those two competing threads that weaved throughout culture, one was mainly for the soldiers, of course.
Right.
Whereas Christianity could have been for anyone and everyone, which probably gave them the upper hand. But is that true even?
Well, I mean, I think that what gave ultimately it's all a question of just luck, really. I mean, it's very it's very I mean, there's, I mean, the fact that Constantine's mother was Christian, or something like that. I mean, he has a Christian milieu, probably played a larger role because ultimately he decides.
I'm just thinking culturally, like, so
Yeah.
you already have a cultural
I
softening.
think that it was neck and neck. I mean, it could have gone either way, Mithra or Christianity, and it went that route. Just it really was just a chance thing.
And then
'Cause,
Mithras specifically, though, is there continuity back to the Persian god?
well, yes and no. I mean, it's different. Of course, there is a relationship. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as continuity,
Mhm.
but they did, of course, adopt certain features from the Indo-Iranian Mithra, but it's very different,
Okay.
and it's all. But and I'm not sure that they took it directly from the Persians. I mean, the Greek historians talked a lot, wrote a lot about the Persian Mithra,
Mhm.
and so that might have been through the Greek historians, that something that it wasn't directly related, but that they adopted that from the prism of the Greek historians. So who knows?
Indirect
Yeah,
way of still kind of continuing the deity's name and in some way.
all right.
Okay.
It could. I mean, it could be direct. It could be. We don't know. Or maybe someone that I don't know about did publish something serious about this that I'm not familiar with. But from what I know, I don't see any direct continuity. I mean, of course, there is relationship,
Mhm.
but doesn't mean that there is a direct kind of evolutionary, continuum from one to another. And I don't think there is.
You brought up the point that obviously non-Jews are calling upon Yahweh. That's clear, especially when we look at even Christians, right? And the excuse, I'll say, is that, well, now you have these non-Jews attracted to synagogues, listening to the preaching, and then becoming converts, some of them, and some of them, which this is true, this happens, but they think the only way they get introduced is here's these synagogues across, not the only way, but like mostly here are these synagogues that are all over in the diaspora, and so now they're getting introduced to this God, which is through only this literature path. And you're saying, no, 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 it's messier than that, way messier than that. It's word of mouth. People know about this. They're going down there to the local person to get
So
medicine.
Yahwism was very popular, and again, we see it all over the Roman Empire.
Right.
Um, Many amulets, many curse texts, I mean, so much all over the place, that Yahweh was clearly a very, very powerful deity, and very sought out for all kinds of health and protection and things like that.
You mean people
Uh,
got sick back then? Hey, oh man. So
well,
this point, this is an interesting point, and I want us to kind of dive into that as you're explaining this. In what way does Yahwism, your study of Yahwism, as someone who's so highly focused on this God, his name, theophoric names attached to it, and the cults and the different things from amulets you described in magic, how does this shift what you see happening in New Testament scholarship? Now, I know you're not a New Testament scholar. This is going to get you into trouble, clearly, with people who might be on the more conservative side or even get defensive about their own scholarly circles. They get mad at me all the time, too. So do you think that for the most part, New Testament studies is kind of coming at it wrong and doesn't really get the big picture of what's happened before with Yahwism? Because they've been mostly indoctrinated through the idea of like, here's this Jewish lineage of Jewish literature that only came, like, you get the typical, I'm sure, view, whereas you're saying, no, you're not getting big picture.
Right. So I mean, again, like you said, I'm not a New Testament scholar, and I don't want to talk specifically about New Testament scholarship per se.
Yeah.
But I can talk about, first century, second century of the Common Era. And from what I do know about New Testament scholarship, and I'm just going to say that in passing without getting into it. Often the questions is, how does it relate to Judaism?
Right.
Right. And so you see the kind of the Jesus movement coming out of Judaism, and so they always look back to Judaism before Jesus, and then
Judaism
in parallel to Jesus and with Jesus, and
yeah,
the different interactions, etc. But as if there are only two options.
Got it.
Now they do look at Gnosticism. It's so-called Gnosticism, again, another term that I really don't like.
I know,
because it's a pejorative name, but we'll use it for convenience. So they do look at that, and there are many different sects within Gnosticism, and they look at that in terms of how that might be relative to certain parts of the New Testament, like Jude and Second Peter and things like that, where you can
the
see
Gospel of John,
but especially really kind of we see it very clearly in Second Peter and Jude, and even Enoch, of course. And so these parts of New Testament studies, do take into account Gnosticism. But then the question is, what is Gnosticism?
Yeah.
And for a lot of the scholarship, unfortunately, and that's where I do come in, my research looks at Gnosticism as heretical Christianity, which it's not.
Yeah.
Right? It is simply another step in the evolution of Yahwism. And so Gnosticism, again, the so-called Gnosticism, has a lot of the elements that we find in earlier Yahwism, including Khnum, right? We talked about Khnum earlier. Khnum here called Knubis. It's the same deity. By the way, already at Elephantine, he's called Khnub with the B, not Khnum with an M. But also already at Elephantine. So that's
5th century, ladies and gentlemen.
That's the first time he's documented as not just Khnum, but also Khnub. And then we find that in so many Gnostic.
And these are like, I would almost argue, I'm not going to say there isn't DNA and then that lines into the Jewish genealogy, but like these are mostly Romans and Greeks, or people who are not in Judaism. A lot of them are speaking against it. A lot of them are communicating, going, no, this is an evil creator. Not all, but there are people who are doing that. Just to make the point again, they want to argue, well, it all started because of just Christianity. If it weren't for Christianity, they want to almost say this Gnostic stuff comes later.
Right.
You're saying, no, nice try, buddy. Look back here. It's not like, oh, it just stopped at the 3rd century BC and then they picked it up at the 2nd century. No, it's been going on.
I mean, we talked about Anat Yahu earlier, which is one of the in the triad at Elephantine. Right at the end of around 400 BCE, this triad that we talked about at Elephantine that had Yah, Anat Bet El, and Eshem Bet El.
Right.
At that time, there's another document that mentions Anat Yahu, so like a dyad of Anat and Yahu, a different document.
Got it.
Around the same time period, and this day, the Anat Yahu we also find in a magic medallion, a Gnostic medallion. From I think it's the 3rd century of the Common Era, or the 2nd century of the Common Era, So, we find that the same deity that we find at Elephantine in the 5th century. And we find Khnum. Knubis, very popular in Gnostic material. So, so there is a clear continuity from Yahwism into elements of Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism, of course, in the 1st century BCE and then into the 1st centuries of the Common Era, of course, we are talking about a much more developed, evolved form of Yahwism compared to the Elephantine version of this. And obviously, they continue to absorb all kinds of ideas from the Roman world, just like the Jews at Elephantine or the Yahwists at Elephantine absorbed ideas from the Persians and from the Egyptians and from the Levantine people over there. They continue to absorb ideas from the Romans, from the Greeks, from Egyptians, later Egyptians as well. And so everything was effervescent. I come back to this idea. Everything was bubbling. Everything was so dynamic. What I love about that period is just how dynamic, how energetic you feel when you deal with those primary sources. You feel the energy today, thousands of years later, but you still feel the energy. And I think the catalyst for that energy goes back to Alexandria, because all this idea, this dealing with these texts, these new texts, and now trying to figure out which is right, which is wrong, what the authority is of each text, and all of that. I mean, the catalyst for this kind of effervescent reality goes back to Alexandria, and that launched humanity on a completely different track that continues to our day. But at that time, it was so energetic. When you work with those primary sources, you really feel the energy. 2,000 years later, but we still feel the energy, and that's really a beautiful part of what I do. But in research, I mean, just being able to interact with these primary documents.
So when I look at texts like the Enochian text, and it even seems like this could be the case for other Gnostic-y groups, they put the blame on the fall of this world.
Enochian text with Gnostic-y.
Okay.
Yeah. There's a difference.
I know that Enoch they put the blame on the reason things are in the state they are in this fallen type state or in a bad situation, has to do with a celestial downfall. When you read Genesis, it's humans. We are wicked, our heart's wicked, we are the problem. You could make a case the sons of God, but it doesn't look like that they're the reason. Humanity gets the punishment. Whereas in Enoch, it sounds like the heavens get this problem. And you find in some of the writings like Jubilees that it's angels that give the law. It's angels that gave this law. And then you find in Paul, right, where he's even saying like mediators gave us this to try and, I feel, in some way, he's trying to downplay the significance that maybe some other Yahwists have about the law, that it's eternal and that this is not like some mediator. God did this, which that's a whole nother thing, right? Yahwist disputing. I wonder how much of your research or this idea of Yahwism would change how New Testament scholars are viewing the rise of Christianity and its literature, because I do find elements of this Gnostic-y, I'll use the term, material in the New Testament.
Sure.
But I also see stuff that seems like it's not quite necessarily in that vein. And do you have any conjecture you'd like to add on what you think might be happening? Do you think that Christian origins, I'm speaking of, like the literature that we have, do you think that this has some favoring one side or the other over the other in its origins, or there's just no way to know?
Well, I mean, to a certain degree, yes, and of course, ultimately, there'll always be elements of that we can't know. Reality is always much more complex than we can realize. But Yahwism, of course, continued to function and to evolve in parallel as Christianity was being developed. Yahwism was already a very well-established and very popular cultic system. And Christianity had to deal with it, and it did. It had to deal with... So Christianity, one thing that I think my research might be a major impact on New Testament studies is to start now looking at Yahwism in a broader sense within the context of what impacted the development of Christianity and of the text of the New Testament itself. Now, Christianity, of course, is much more than just the New Testament, right? All of these, the Gospels didn't make it into the New Testament, and all of these other texts that were written at the same time,
Right.
but did not make it into the New Testament, but were seen by the people who wrote it as being as quote unquote Christian as anything else, right?
Exactly.
So Christianity is much more than just the New Testament. In these other texts, if you look at the Gospel of Peter or the Gospel of whatever you want to look at, they might have elements in them, and they do, that are closer to certain aspects of Yahwism than parts of the New Testament, and vice versa. There might be parts that are in the New Testament that are closer to elements of Yahwism. Now, we also need to keep in mind that the first and second centuries of the Common Era are already, I don't know, fifth, sixth generation after Alexandria, and after the, or much more than that after Alexandria.
Yeah.
After the when the Bible became an authoritative text. Again, not sacred, per se, but an authoritative text. And now you have layers upon layers of interpretation. So in the New Testament, it's really breathtaking, the level of the layers of interpretation that you see to certain aspects of the biblical text. Now you have really layers of exegesis that form their own tradition, right?
Yeah.
And so, but that's what I talk about when I refer to the how effervescent the entire, because suddenly all of these texts are vying for authority, and they're all considered authoritative by different groups, but they kind of there's polemics, there's apologetics between the different groups, and then you start building layers, because at some point you can't move laterally, you have to start building up. And so you have all of these people thinking
and competing too,
but it's so energetic.
Yeah.
And it's beautiful to see just how much how rich this whole process was. I mean, ultimately it came down to us today as the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. But in reality, in real time, if we were to be transported back 2,000 years, or even 1,800 years back, we would be in a very, very dynamic field. Very energetic, again, very dynamic field, very exciting, because of the exchange of ideas, people going here and going there and trying this and trying that, and trying to take elements from here and from Mithra and from Isis and from the Serapis and from Dionysus and from whatever. They try to put it all together and to see how that works, and who's ready to accept it and adopt this. And it was a very, very exciting time, very energetic. And I think that's, for me, one of the main things that I always love to see is that energy in these documents. It's an energy that we do not find as much in the Bible. The Bible is much more codified, right? It's much more, because it went through a process of canonization, it becomes fossilized. But if we look at the reality of these centuries, wow, the energy is just all over. It's just bubbling all over the place. It's really, really beautiful.
Something that's been blowing my mind lately is, and I didn't have a clue about this, there's certain scholars I've been learning about this from, is noticing how there is that energy you're describing, but competitive, and they're taking each other down. Early church fathers, when they are critiquing Dionysus, what do they do with the cult of Dionysus? Debauchery, orgy, sexual immorality, drunkenness, every negative bad thing that, guess what? You can find ancient texts that do depict these things, right? So what do? In a sense, they straw man the cult by finding, and it's partially not a straw man, because you could find the texts that indicate this, or Zeus, golden shower, or raping some woman or something, right? But when you actually are asking the people at that time what they believe about Dionysus or Zeus or Heracles, Heracles has got some adventures if you find those in the history. However, the cynics said he was the most righteous, the most moral of all humans on earth. He was a savior of the world. They saw him that. That meant they reinterpreted him in their own way at their own time. So the church fathers are straw manning the position of the current cynic, the current Dionysian person who saw Dionysus in a more ascetic way.
Right.
Well, here is what I also find within Gnostic circles. The ones that are actually, and this is what I wanted to ask you about them, whether or not they're Yahwist or not. When they are then making Yahweh the evil creator, and Yahweh is actually not the good guy. Now, it's not hard to search through your Bible and find out real quick why Yahweh is not a good God.
Right.
Now, if you're a Christian who stands on the hill and has to reinterpret everything and you're a fundamentalist, of course, we know what you're going to say. We've heard it 1,000 times.
Right.
But it's really quick to go, you're pointing at Zeus, you're pointing at Dionysus, but your own tradition, your own texts say these things. But it's not how you understand him. Okay. So here you have these two competing versions.
Right.
Are they Yahwist? Are the people who are saying Yahweh is a demiurge, but he doesn't realize there's a God above him? Are they Yahwist? Are they a form of Yahwist? What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say they're a form of Yahwists. I mean, Yahwists don't have to necessarily have a positive view, and then like the Greeks themselves. I mean, they had also a very negative view of certain of their central gods. So some of their central gods. So it doesn't mean. I mean, it's a god. It's a god that you're afraid of, and it depends on the situation that you're in. So I would say that there are still Yahwists as well. But we need more context. Every time we need more context. Yeah. So
What about the traditions that like Greeks and Romans had that you find a propaganda against Jews and their God? Their God, the donkey-headed deity that's in the temple, he is Set. They make him evil. What about the idea with Apion? Apion makes this accusation to Josephus that's quite scandalous if you haven't seen it, where he says Jews fatten up Greeks once a year, making them full and chubby, and then they sacrifice them. And not only that, they eat them. At a certain time of the year, they eat them, and then they throw and discard whatever's left into a grave. I had someone write me this today, actually. It was like, this looks and almost sounds like the Jesus story in a way. And I'm like, let's not get too,
that's
it could have overlap, but that seems to be more of a stretch to me.
Yeah.
Anyway, like, what's going on with that? Are these anti-Yahwist?
Well, these are. I mean, this is certainly anti-Jewish.
Got
at
it.
that point, this is even really anti-Semitic. I don't like to use anti-Semitic because that's anachronistic to that time. But in a sense, that's really
What it is.
what it is. And I mean, that's basically a blood libel on the Jews at the time that they're. But people did that to each other at the time anyway, not just the Jews.
Is it possible that there's any historical reality to them practicing such a thing?
No.
Well, okay, we needed to hear that because some people are like, what if the Jews really were?
No.
Okay.
No. No, there's no there. No, but there's a lot of no. I mean, but
That would be insane.
yeah, it's just but the no, of course not. But there are this extreme depiction of the other
Yes.
as something that is completely evil is very common in antiquity. So we do have that. And so I mean, we have that also in the Bible, in certain oracles against the nations, where the nations are described as certain nations like Babylon are described as whores, right? As completely. So the idea,
Even Rome. Rome is called that in Revelation.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly. So so you have this depiction of the other as this extremely negative,
The worst you
evil,
can think
the
of.
worst you can think of.
Early Christians did that to the Gnostics.
Yeah,
They were
yeah.
cannibalizing. There were sexual orgies, making up
That's right. That's right. So none of these stories have anything, real in them. It's just this evil depiction of the other. And unfortunately, even today we do that, right? To the other, right?
Right.
We have people I mean, Islamophobia and things like that are still so rampant in our society today. That always seek to present the other as somehow inherently evil.
Yeah.
We still do this today, and that's maybe one of the lessons that we need to learn from history, is that these depictions are never real.
Yeah.
They're never real, and we should really fight, I mean, intellectually fight against these things.
No, that's what we're trying to do right now. We're trying to defang ignorance. I think when you give facts, even if it's ugly, you have to swallow a hard pill, you swallow a hard pill. But the bottom line is, when you do that, it does break down those fictitious walls that we have about the other.
Okay.
And once you learn about the other, they bleed like you, they love like you, they hurt like you. And that's important. So my final thing, as we recap, this is important to kind of go back and just generally summarize what Yahwism is. But I do wish, just like we have plenty of material with the name Yahweh in it from the Bible, we have synagogues, we have like a tradition that became very rooted in Yahwism to the point where they have legal codes and a chosen nation, the whole nine. I wish there was more than just magical papyri and like little like not here's a codified text that we have, right? That really has, we know we worship Yahweh. I wish it was more than just, here's this like curse tablet. Here is this magical papyri where I need that.
Well, I mean, but it shouldn't surprise you, because Yahwism is not based on authoritative texts like the Judaism, and so that spawn from Yahwism. The whole point of that is to spawn into this idea of authoritative text. Yahwism continued pretty much the way it was before, without authoritative texts.
When did it fizzle out somewhat, would you say?
I'm not sure it really ever did. I mean, in a way, Yahwism still exists even today in Kabbalah, for example. A certain form of Yahwism exists in certain interpretations of the Kabbalistic, universe of deities. I mean, in the Kabbalah, you have this tree of spheres. You have this 10 deities, really, and you have a female deity that goes up and down the tree and copulates with Yahweh. Wow. In Kabbalah, right? In the Zohar, you actually have, I mean, some have called it a pornographic book, because you actually have a description, a very, very, very detailed description of interportal between Yahweh and the Shekhinah, for example. So you have, and I mean, literally describing how the sperm goes from one to another. I mean, literally, it's you can tell guys wrote this. Yeah, absolutely. But this was so in a sense, and so scholars of Kabbalah have said that there are Gnostic influences on Kabbalah.
No wonder.
But what I'm saying is that there are Yahwistic influences in Kabbalah. I mean,
so it might be Gnostic, but again, it gets to that point of like Mithras might have been filtered through the Greek sources and not directly necessarily from Persians, and how the Romans adopted this deity, or deity, however you pronounce it. This is fascinating. So we have this God Yahweh, who ends up being quite an interesting deity that everyone seemed to have known in some way, shape, or form by the Roman period. I'm not going to say everyone literally, like we can't go back and interview them all, but it's a very popular all over the place. Which would explain why non-Jews are attracted to anything Yahweh related, including going to Jewish synagogues, especially if they already have this deity at heart or know anything about it.
Right.
Now they're getting closer to home. It's down the street. They're going to help their Jewish friend who also has a similar God that they're willing to adopt.
Yeah, but also the Jews. I mean, the Jews, right? Those who are following the commandments of Moses, etc. When they had someone sick in their home, they would go to a Yahwist for a curse text and things like that. And we find that in the magical bowls, right? The Aramaic magical bowls that are found in Babylonia in the 5th century, 6th century of the Common Era. At the same place where the Talmud is being written, at the same time, you have Jewish texts that are about protecting the family from Lilith, right, or protecting from the evil eye, or from the angels, and all kinds of voces magica, all kinds of words, magical words and magical expressions to protect the people. But these are Jews writing at the same time the Talmud is being written next door, and actually in some of them they actually mention names of people that we also know from the Talmud.
Oh, wow.
And so, but at the same time, they're actually availing themselves of magic, so, again, everything is so much more dynamic in reality. And also think about it. You have a family member maybe that's about to die, or a child that's about to die, very, very sick. You will do everything. I mean, it's not you won't say, okay, well, my Bible says no. But next door someone is selling a curse text that could help your child. You will go for that.
Of course.
And
I would do that today.
Yeah, and so
If I
everything.
thought it might help.
Yeah, there you go. And so people in the ancient world, I mean, everything was so much. So there wasn't. I mean, you shouldn't think of this Orthodox Jew who never
Right.
looks right and left, and
Or Orthodox
doesn't,
Christianity,
or
even.
Orthodox Christian who never looks right or left, and never goes to never has like a Gnostic type amulet on him. And so we have. I mean, things are very, very dynamic, and this is what's so beautiful about our field. Really, everything is so much more complex, so much more effervescent, and the historical realities was so much richer and more beautiful than what these books, reflect. Even I'm not just talking about the Bible or the New Testament, but even more than what Josephus
Yeah.
has, or more than what
Plutarch or
Right, etc.
And they say some good stuff.
And they say some great stuff. But what I like is to deal with primary material that were written by simple people, ostraca, papyri, and things like that were written by people who never thought that anyone would read them past tomorrow.
Yeah.
Right? Not even 2,000 years later, but the simple people writing to each other. That is truly the richest material, the most exciting material, the most energetic material. Even these amulets, these curse texts, everything that you see on this is the exciting and energetic, and this is what gives our field this really the kind of the energy to continue and dig deeper.
I know for a fact you're going to continue to dig. I hope more scholars also continue to do so, and I know they will. Me and Neil tend to have this thing where we kind of gravitate toward ideas, and when we're fascinated with it, we have tunnel vision on the idea that we're looking into. That doesn't mean we have tunnel vision. We actually have quite an open, broadened perspective, I think. And a lot of times scholars tend to be zeroing in on very focused things.
Right.
And
Which is normal.
That's normal.
Yeah.
It's just that communication, cross communication from different departments and different fields. And then when, how that communication takes place and being able to see that big picture, I think we're fortunate to be in a position where we're able to interview 20 different academics on one topic, hear 19 different conclusions pertaining to it, 5 of them aligned with each other. And we think those 5 make more sense than the 15 who might say something else. Oh, we're not on the consensus side. Well, I mean, who am I? Now, that's what gets me in trouble. But I love learning these cutting edge ideas. I know that you're going to continue to bring them forward. And I hope that people learn something about Yahwism. Really, it's a mysterious kind of thing. I wish we had more details about, more evidence of, but we have enough to know that it wasn't just Jews who were worshiping this God, even before Judaism.
Right. Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Gad. Any final words from you?
No, I mean, like you said, I mean, Yahwism, I think, is right now. I mean, of course, Yahwism as an idea has been out there for a while, but now I think we're in a new phase where we start to understand through my research and a few others that are dealing, and especially in this book now, that Yahwism is a major force to be reckoned with, and the implications of Yahwism, not just in the Achaemenid Empire, but throughout antiquity, are much, much wider than we ever imagined. And so this is a field of research that now needs to get much more attention. And I think that's what we're planning to do in the next 2 years.
I think these shows are going to get some attention. So thank you so much. I appreciate you. And everybody, never forget, we are Myth Vision.